The moment my husband Edwin Carmichael looked across that courtroom and said, "Lydia contributed nothing meaningful to this firm. She answered a few phones and called it a career," I felt the air leave my body. 32 years of my life reduced to answering phones. I thought I might actually be sick right there in front of the judge. Then the courtroom doors swung open. Giselle Tremblay walked in, carrying a thick manila folder pressed against her chest. The color drained from Edwin's face so completely that even his lawyer turned to look at him. I had spent months convinced that Giselle was the woman who had taken my husband from me. I had no idea she was out to take apart every lie he had told instead. Before I tell you what happened in that courtroom, I want to ask you something. Have you ever sacrificed a version of yourself, your career, your ambitions, your time, for someone who later pretended none of it ever happened? If you have, you already understand how this story begins. My name is Lydia Carmichael, and I am 63 years old. I live in Hamilton, Ontario, and for most of my adult life, I believed that love meant building something together. That partnership was the whole point, that the person beside you remembered what you both came from. Edwin and I met at a church potluck dinner in the East End of Hamilton in the autumn of 1991. I was 31 years old, working as an office administrator for a mid-sized insurance company on King Street. Edwin was 34, a quiet man with calloused hands and an enormous ambition he hadn't yet figured out how to act on. He was doing contract carpentry work then, nothing glamorous, just honest labor and a notebook full of half-formed plans. On our third date, he pulled that notebook from his coat pocket and laid it on the table between us. He wanted to build a real estate development company someday. He'd been studying the Hamilton market for years. He just needed a partner who believed in him. I believed in him completely. I still think that was the most generous thing I ever did for anyone. We married the following spring. The early years were tight in the way that young married life often is, except ours had an added weight. Edwin wanted to move quickly. He saw opportunity in the Hamilton housing market before most people did, back when Barton Street neighborhoods still felt forgotten and the lower city hadn't yet caught anyone's attention. He found a small property, drew up a business plan, and spent 4 months trying to get a bank to take him seriously. 3 banks said no. The 4th looked at his application and then looked at me. The loan officer, a careful man named Mr. Arsenault, pushed the paperwork across his desk. "Mrs. Carmichael," he said, "if you're willing to personally guarantee this loan, that changes our position." Edwin immediately said no. He didn't want me carrying that risk. I looked at my husband's face, the hope in it, the exhaustion of being told no again and again, and I signed. My credit history, my name on the line, my financial liability if everything fell apart. That signature was how Carmichael Property Group came into existence. For the next several years, while Edwin managed sites and courted investors and built his reputation, I handled everything else. I did the bookkeeping from our kitchen table after our son Lucas went to bed. I typed up contracts, filed tax documents, managed client correspondence, and handled payroll when we couldn't yet afford to hire someone to do it properly. I worked full-time at the insurance company during the day and worked for the firm every evening and weekend. There were winters in Hamilton, and anyone who knows Hamilton knows the winters. When I drove to a job site in February to drop off documents because there wasn't enough staff to cover it, I never complained. I thought we were building something together. I thought that was what marriage was. The firm grew. 1 property became 5, then 12, then a full portfolio. Edwin hired staff. He hired a head bookkeeper, a competent, organized woman named Giselle Tremblay, who came with excellent references and proved herself indispensable within her first year. I stepped back gratefully. After nearly a decade of doing 2 jobs at once, I was ready to let someone else carry the spreadsheets. I remember a summer evening on our back deck when Lucas was about 16, when Edwin wrapped his arm around me and said, "None of this happens without you." I kept that sentence for years like a keepsake. I returned to it whenever things felt difficult. I told myself my husband knew. He understood. He remembered. I should have noticed sooner when he stopped rimming. The changes arrived slowly, the way a season changes, almost imperceptibly until one day you realize the leaves have been gone for weeks. Edwin began investing heavily in appearances. Bespoke suits, a membership at a golf club in Ancaster, dinners with investors where I was no longer included. At first I told myself it was business. A growing company needs professional relationships. Of course he was busy. Of course I wasn't needed at every function. Then he started mentioning Giselle Tremblay constantly. Giselle reorganized the accounts. Giselle handled that investor. Giselle caught an error that saved them considerable money. Every conversation somehow circled back to Giselle. I tried not to read into it. Edwin had complimented employees before. That was what a good employer did. But then small things started accumulating the way they do. His phone was always face down on any flat surface. His password changed without explanation. He started ending calls when I entered a room. One Thursday evening, we were eating dinner when a message came through. He grabbed the phone before I could see the screen, and something crossed his face. Not guilt, exactly, but a kind of careful awareness that I hadn't seen before. 3 weeks later, I found a hotel receipt in the pocket of his sport coat. I was carrying the coat to the dry cleaner. The receipt was for a suite at the Sheraton Center in Toronto. 2 nights, 2 weeks before. The same 2 nights Edwin had told me he was at a conference in Barrie. Room service, dinner for 2. A bottle of wine that cost more than our first grocery bill together. I stood in the hallway of my own house holding that small piece of paper, and I felt the ground shift. Not collapse. Shift. The way ice moves on a lake in March. Slow, barely visible, but something fundamental is changing beneath the surface. I put the receipt back. I didn't say anything yet. I still had the habit of protecting him that 30 years of marriage builds into a person. I tried one last time to reach him. Our 32nd anniversary was in April. I made a reservation at a restaurant in Dundas, a beautiful old converted mill we had visited once before when we were young and had to share a dessert because a full order was too expensive. I thought going back might remind us both of who we used to be. Edwin was on his phone through most of the drive. He laughed twice at messages, genuinely, openly, and said almost nothing to me. When we sat down, he checked his phone again within minutes of opening his menu. I set mine down and asked him directly, "Edwin, are you seeing someone?" He didn't deny it. He didn't reassure me. He set his fork down and gave me a look I hadn't seen before. A look that contained something cold and very final. And he said, "Lydia, the problem is that you've been living in the same decade for 30 years. Some of us have grown beyond that." I stared at him. What does that mean? He glanced around the restaurant with the expression of a man who finds the whole situation mildly tedious. "It means someone who contributed nothing meaningful to building what we have shouldn't expect to hold the same position forever." I remember thinking, this is who he has become, not who he was, who he has become. Near the entrance, a woman had just walked in and frozen when she saw us. Giselle Tremblay. She stood very still for a moment, and then her eyes moved from me to Edwin, and the look on her face was not what I expected. It wasn't guilt, and it wasn't affection. It was something closer to discomfort, to shame, as though she had just witnessed something she wished she hadn't had to see. Edwin noticed her. For just a moment, something flickered in his expression. Then Giselle turned and walked to another section of the restaurant. Before she disappeared, she glanced back once. And the look she gave me. I couldn't interpret it then. I understand it now. The divorce papers arrived 11 days later. A courier brought them to my front door on a rainy Tuesday morning. I carried the envelope inside, set it on the kitchen table, the same table where I had done a decade of bookkeeping by hand, and read every page carefully. Edwin's position was that Carmichael Property Group represented the result of his individual expertise and vision, that my contributions had been administrative in nature, that the firm's assets belonged primarily to him. Administrative, after everything. That evening, my son Lucas called. I had hoped he was calling to check on me. He was calling to tell me that things would go more smoothly if I didn't make this difficult. "Dad worked incredibly hard for everything the firm has," he said. "You know that, Mom." "Lucas," I said quietly, "do you know who guaranteed the original bank loan?" Silence. "Do you know who did the payroll when the firm couldn't afford an accountant? Who handled client files every evening while you did your homework at the kitchen table beside me?" More silence then. That was a long time ago. I ended the call. His wife, Brianna, phoned the next morning. Her message was briefer and less kind. She suggested I accept whatever offer Edwin's lawyers put forward, and not drag this into something ugly. She used the phrase Edwin's firm 3 times without seeming to notice she was doing it. I went to the basement. I spent 2 full days going through 30 years of filing boxes, utility bills and tax returns and old Christmas cards. And then, near the bottom of a box I had labeled simply Business, 1993, I found the original loan documents. My signature on every page, my guarantee, my financial risk, the reason the loan was approved at all. In a separate box, I found a letter Edwin had written me during the firm's hardest year, when 3 projects were stalled and bankruptcy had seemed genuinely possible. He had written, "Lydia, I don't have the words for what you've given this company. If we survive this, and I believe we will, it will be because of you as much as me. I love you." I sat on the concrete floor of my basement, holding that letter for a long time. My lawyer, Deborah Haynes, reviewed the loan documents that afternoon. Her voice became noticeably more focused when I described what I'd found. "Keep those originals safe," she told me. "His version of events has some serious problems." Then I began noticing gaps in the files I still had access to. Records that should have been there weren't. An index sheet listed folders that no longer existed. The missing documents weren't misplaced. They had been removed, deliberately. I also found financial statements I couldn't make sense of, repeated transfers, specific amounts, consistent timing. I had spent years managing records. My instincts told me something was wrong. I forwarded everything to Deborah. She called back within 2 days. "Some of these accounts don't appear in Edwin's disclosure," she said carefully. "We need a forensic review." Carmichael Property Group was hiding money, and it had been planned for months before he filed. 3 weeks before the preliminary hearing, my phone rang. A number I didn't recognize. "Mrs. Carmichael?" The voice was soft, careful, familiar in the way a name can be familiar before you understand why. "Yes. This is Giselle Tremblay." I didn't speak. Of all the calls I might have received, that was the one I least expected. "I know this isn't what you want to hear from me," she said, "but there are things you don't know." "I should have called sooner. I'm sorry I didn't." We met the following Saturday at a coffee shop near Lock Street, a quiet place I liked, because it attracted regulars who kept to themselves. Giselle arrived before I did and was already seated when I walked in. She looked exhausted, not the confident, capable professional I had imagined over months of resenting her name. She looked like someone who hadn't slept properly in a very long time. I sat down. "Are you sleeping with my husband?" She looked genuinely startled. "No," she said, "never." "Then why has he been hiding your messages for 2 years?" She took a slow breath. "Because it suited him for people to wonder." Over the next hour, Giselle Tremblay explained something I had not anticipated. Edwin had never corrected the rumors about the 2 of them. He had let people assume. He had sometimes encouraged the assumption. A comment here. An implication there. Because as long as people were looking at Giselle, they weren't looking at what he was actually doing. Giselle was a distraction. A story that wasn't true, allowed to grow because it was useful. "Useful for what?" I asked. She placed a folder on the table between us. "For hiding Monique Vautier." "The name meant nothing to me," Giselle explained. Monique Vautier was a real estate agent in Burlington who had worked with the firm on several projects over the past 4 years. The relationship was financial long before it became personal, and it had been personal for nearly 3 years. The folder contained printed email records, transfer logs, and calendar entries. The transfers connected to accounts in Monique Vautier's name were substantial. Apartment costs, vehicle payments, travel, deposits. Money that should have been part of our shared marital estate was supporting a separate life. "I started saving copies 18 months ago," Giselle said, "when I realized what I was processing. At first, I thought it was a tax strategy I didn't understand. Then it kept going." "Why are you giving this to me now?" She looked down at her coffee. "I was at that restaurant in Dundas in April. I heard what he said to you." Her voice was quiet. "He said it in public and he wasn't even embarrassed." She met my eyes. "I can't keep being the reason people look away from the truth." Before we left, she pressed a flash drive into my hand. A backup, she said, of everything. She asked me to make sure my lawyer had it regardless of what happened. If something happens to me, she said, and then stopped herself. Just make sure she has it. Giselle disappeared 4 days before the hearing. She didn't answer messages. She didn't respond to calls. I spent those 4 days sick with anxiety, convinced that Edwin had found out. The morning of the preliminary hearing, I sat in the courtroom beside Deborah Haynes and watched the empty witness chair, and tried to believe it would be all right. Edwin sat across the room looking like a man who expected to win. His lawyers presented the familiar argument with professional confidence. Edwin's vision, Edwin's leadership, Edwin's firm. My role described as informal, supplementary, minimal. I listened to my life being dismantled in careful legal language, and I kept my hands flat on the table in front of me. Then, in the early afternoon, Deborah stood. Your Honor, we'd like to call Giselle Tremblay. The room went quiet. Nothing happened. The doors remained closed. 30 seconds passed that felt much longer. Then the doors opened. Giselle Tremblay walked in. She looked pale and tired, and she was carrying the same manila folder she had shown me at the coffee shop. Edwin's expression changed so completely, and so quickly that several people in the room noticed. The confidence was gone. What replaced it was something I had never seen in 32 years of knowing him. Fear. Giselle took the witness stand and answered Deborah's early questions steadily. Employment history, responsibilities, duration of service. Then the real testimony began. She confirmed the transfers. She confirmed the accounts. She walked the court through 18 months of financial records that Edwin had never disclosed. She confirmed that money connected to the marital estate had been redirected to support Monique Vautier. Edwin's lawyer objected repeatedly. The judge allowed Giselle to continue. Then Deborah asked if Giselle had ever recorded conversations in the workplace. Edwin was on his feet before the question finished. Objection! The judge reviewed the matter. After several minutes, he ruled that the recordings were admissible. What the courtroom heard next was Edwin's voice, clear and unhurried, speaking to an unknown third party in his office. At first, it was ordinary business talk. Then someone asked about the divorce. Edwin's response: no mediator is going to side with a woman who did nothing but manage a few files and convince herself that made her a partner. The courtroom was completely still. And then Deborah asked the question I had been waiting months to hear answered properly. Miss Tremblay, throughout this case, many people assumed you were personally involved with Mr. Carmichael. Were you? No. Was there another woman? Giselle looked at Edwin for a long moment. Then she said, yes, Monique Vautier. The room erupted in low murmurs. Documents appeared on the court display. The transfer records, the email chains, the account summaries Giselle had preserved. The picture was impossible to misread. But there was one more detail. Deborah displayed a series of text messages. They connected Monique Vautier to someone else in the courtroom. To Brianna. My daughter-in-law Brianna, who had called me to suggest I accept Edwin's settlement and not make things ugly. Brianna, who knew Monique Vautier, who had known her for years, who had received messages from Monique in the months before Edwin filed for divorce. Brianna's face, when those messages appeared on the screen, went completely white. Beside her, my son Lucas looked at her, then at the screen, then at his father, and I watched something in him collapse. He looked like a person discovering that the floor has been hollow for years. I didn't look away from him. For a long time I had needed him to see the truth, and now he was seeing it, and it cost both of us something to be in that room together. The judge's ruling, when it came, was careful and thorough. Edwin had not built Carmichael Property Group alone. The evidence demonstrated sustained and material contributions from me over more than 2 decades. The financial disclosure Edwin had submitted was incomplete in several significant respects. Additional review of the firm's accounts would be required. The marital assets would be divided to reflect the actual history of our partnership. And the man who had sat across a restaurant table and told me that I had contributed nothing meaningful would now face questions he had not prepared to answer. After the ruling, Edwin found me in the corridor outside the courtroom. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him. "You didn't have to do this," he said. I looked at him for a moment, not with anger. The anger had burned out somewhere during those 4 days I spent sitting with Deborah Haynes reviewing documents until midnight. What remained was something quieter and more permanent. "I didn't do this to you, Edwin," I said. "You did it to yourself." He didn't answer. He walked away down the corridor, and I let him go. Lucas called 3 weeks later and asked if he could come by. We met on the front porch of the house I still lived in then, the house we'd bought in 1998 when the firm was beginning to find its footing. He sat across from me and said he was sorry. Not a small defensive sorry. A real one. He told me he had known more than he admitted. That Brianna had told him things she asked him to keep between them. That he had chosen his father's version of events because it was easier than questioning it. We talked for nearly 2 hours. It wasn't a repair, not yet, maybe not for a long time, but it was honest, and after everything, honesty felt like enough to start with. I sold the house that autumn. People thought I was strange for letting it go after fighting so hard for what I was owed, but keeping it would have meant living inside 32 years of a story that was over. I didn't want a museum. I wanted a life. I bought a smaller place near the escarpment, full of light, close to walking trails, entirely mine. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I opened a free Saturday workshop for women in Hamilton called Foundations. 2 hours, twice a month, in the meeting room of a community center on James Street North. Financial literacy, basic legal awareness, what to keep, what to document, why your name on a loan matters even when everything feels stable. There is no fee. There is coffee. And there are women who come in looking like they have no idea what they are worth, and who leave understanding a little more clearly that their silence was not the same as their absence. Giselle Tremblay helps me run it. After everything that happened at the firm, she decided she didn't want to work for someone else's company anymore. She started her own bookkeeping practice in the spring. I send her every client I can. Someone told me recently that Edwin's dealings with the Burlington properties are still under review. I don't spend much time thinking about it. The outcome of his choices belongs to him now, not to me. What I think about instead is the loan document in that box in my basement, my name on every page, the handwriting unchanged after 30 years. I think about the woman who signed it, young and hopeful and absolutely certain that what she was giving was an investment in something shared. She was right about the investment. She was wrong about only one thing. She thought the person she was building it with would always remember. Some people, it turns out, only remember as long as remembering costs them nothing. If you are that woman, the one holding everything together in the background, the one whose name never makes it into the story that gets told at dinner parties, I want you to know something. The contributions that go unacknowledged do not disappear. They exist in the documents. They exist in the records. They exist in the signatures. And sometimes, when it matters most, they walk through a courtroom door and they speak. Your value does not depend on whether the person beside you has chosen to see it. It was never theirs to grant or take away. It was always yours.